Hello YouTube! Today we're going to be discussing whether or not Steve Reeves was really a natural bodybuilder. I'm going to base this video off of the infamous nattyornot.com website, as I've done in the past, because they always provide great content for me to react to. But this video is not going to be scripted at all, because this is typically the type of article that just by reading it, it's going to build up so much pent-up rage that I don't really have to try and come up with a script or anything of the sort. It's better raw. So let's get started today. For those who don't know who Steve Reeves was, he is a great inspiration for many natural bodybuilders because he achieved a very muscular, lean and balanced physique at a time where bodybuilding was still in its infancy. And so for a lot of people, he is a model, even a goal physique. And of course, when someone motivates people to get better and to develop their spirituality and their physiques, you will always have people that are going to point it out and say, oh, that person that you like is not actually a good role model, they are a liar. And there's nothing wrong with that. Actually, it's very good to question your inspirations. But the problem I have with the article, and you're going to see that very quickly, is that this is not done in good faith. This is not done by a person who is concerned about your well-being and wants you to have realistic standards or wants you to not actually get sucked into the steroid lifestyle. This is typically someone who fanboys for Steve Reeves, who is most likely very envious of the physique that he built because he wished he could have the same, failed miserably because that person, the truth seeker who writes these articles, sucks, and therefore has decided to make it his life mission to make everyone give up like he did. So let's observe the arguments he presents, because of course he is going to argue in his article that Steve Reeves was actually on a ton of PEDs, that he is a big fat liar. To present the entire argument that this guy actually put forth, let's look at what Steve Reeves' body actually resembled when he was in his prime and even prior to his prime. If you go on Google Image right now and you look at Steve Reeves, you will see that he was someone that, yes, was very developed, but you will not get the sense that there is anything strange with it, meaning that it is not immediately evident that the guy is on stuff. And I know that this means nothing because there's a plethora of people out there, of men who take drugs and who look like shit. So it's not a valid argument. What I want to argue, however, is that, and this is my main point, if Reeves was on drugs, but he didn't look like he was on drugs, then does it really matter if he was on drugs or not? Because at the end of the day, you see that a lot where people point out a physique and say, well, the guy admitted to be on steroids, which Reeves, by the way, never did. And the logic behind it is to say, okay, well, if they admitted that, this means that no one can achieve the same physique without drugs. But that makes no sense, because you can get as good of a physique as someone on drugs naturally if you put in more efforts than them. A lot of people who take drugs, unlike the common myth you see on YouTube Fitness, tend to be lazy. They're not the type who take drugs just to get more work in. They take drugs to replace the work. Does that make sense when you look again at Steve Reeves? I made a full episode on the life of the guy. He was far from being a lazy bone. He was the exact opposite. He was someone who worked from a very young age, was always very physically active, and therefore who earned the physique that he developed. Now, this is just for the basis, because this guy said that the classic physique of Reeves with the white back, the big arms, the athletic legs, etc., is the reason why he wasn't natural, and that it is easy to convince people that he was natural given the current madness observed in professional bodybuilding. So in a sense, he is pinning, no pun intended, the physique of Reeves with the physiques of the pros now, saying, well, it's true that he's smaller than the pros, but that proves nothing, and that is true. He could just be on less steroids. So let us try to defend Steve Reeves' natty status, not to actually protect the guy, he's dead, I don't think he cares, but to protect us. Because this, all of the natty or not, all of the doubt and the skepticism that surrounds the natural physiques that are available to lifters, for the most part, damage our community because they lower your standards. If you're the type of person that looks at Steve Reeves and thinks, oh yeah, there's no way this is achievable naturally, this video is for you. Your standards have been poisoned by a little wimp like this guy. And they've been poisoned because of the arguments used make sense at first, but then when you actually look at them in depth, they just vanish into thin air. So, the article is not long at all. It relies on absolute statements and on absolute authoritative arguments that I'm going to quickly debunk. The first one is the question of whether or not steroids were available during Steve Reeves' career. And the writer of the article says that anabolic steroids were discovered in the 30s. That is correct. Then they say that clinical trials on humans began as early as 1937. That is also correct. And they finish their point by saying that since Reeves was doing competitions in the US in 1947, technically that is 10 years after the first clinical trials, so this must mean that Steve Reeves was on steroids. If you're someone who is impressionable or who doesn't really take the time to understand what you read, you might fall for this and think, okay, mathematically this makes sense. But the issue is that this is the typical type of fallacious argument that pseudo-intellectuals and people who are just gifted enough in the ranks of logic to actually get into your brain, but who lack any type of virtue or moral standard, will be using to make you give up on your dreams of getting good physique. So let's look at the arguments again, but this time with a keen eye and a sense for critic. Steroids as an hormone was discovered in the 30s. This means absolutely nothing. Science and the realm of physics in general discovers particles or even discovers molecules sometimes in biology that we are only able to isolate and use for humans 30, 40, 50 years afterwards. In the field of epidemiology, that is especially true. We have discovered disease that, because there was no incentive or need, never really came forth and never really were researched to the extent that they needed to be researched. Case in point, SARS with the epidemic that we went through, where we have known about this strain of COVID for decades, but it only came back at the forefront of the discussion recently. So, just because the hormone was discovered in the 30s doesn't really mean anything. What matters is whether or not scientists went forth and tried to replicate that and be able to inject humans with that substance, which technically is something that is then pointed out as being as early as 1937. But these are clinical trials. Clinical trials do not correlate to use in the everyday world. It just simply doesn't work like that. Just because a drug has been even approved by the FDA doesn't mean that you're going to see widespread use. I know that it's tough to understand in our world because nowadays you hear about fucking testosterone or you hear about that new strain of, I don't know, poppy that is going to give you massive gains, and within a week it's everywhere on Instagram and TikTok. But back then, there were no such thing as these type of networks. Just because scientists somewhere discovered tests and ran clinical trials doesn't mean that bodybuilders were immediately on the ball, because this would require having the internet or having contacts. Like, I'm trying to understand why this guy thinks happened. Like, you think like the German scientist that discovered testosterone in its exogenous form, the first thing he did when he discovered it was pick up a phone and he called Steve Reeves like, yeah, hello Steve, ich just discovered the hormone for the big bicep, you want? And Steve Reeves like, oh yeah, just send that shit via FedEx, bro. Like, it doesn't work like that. Now today, the field of science is deeply connected with the field of bodybuilding and of fitness in general. Every time there's a new study, you hear about it immediately. But even then, for us, it takes years to put into practice, and many studies get proven correct after 10 years. Back then, they had none of that. It's insanely dishonest to present the idea that Reeves would have had that type of contact. And just to reiterate and also to continuously destroy these poor arguments presented by Truth Seeker, it's even worse than you might think, because the earliest use that we know for certain of anabolic steroids were during the 1954 Olympics, and it was by the Russian team. Russian weightlifters were given testosterone. And from what we know, this is the earliest time where the type of drugs that is now widely used to boost performance was given to athletes to give them an advantage over the competition. 1954. If you say that Steve Reeves was not natural when he competed in the 50s, you're essentially saying that some random guy who lived in the US and who was a small-time bodybuilder, because keep in mind one thing, bodybuilding is a niche sport, was somehow able to get his hands on a drug that even the top-level teams of the biggest country at the time were not able to obtain themselves. You're telling me that Steve Reeves had more connections and more international sway with companies and with clinics than fucking Soviet Russia of the 50s. How plausible is this? Even in the US, if we trace back to who actually brought the hormones over, most of the names are from the mid-50s. You have some guys that appear like Dr. Ziegler, who apparently smuggled some of these drugs and experimented in the US. But even then, why would bodybuilders be the first one to actually benefit from that? Who would gather that type of technology in their luggage, steal it from a country, risk treason charges just to be able to help a guy that is going to step up on stage? It makes absolutely no sense. It's like if you told me that someone stole the nuclear secrets of Japan or China and he decided to go to, I don't know, some place in the middle of Europe to give to a small village so that they could just power up their ovens. Where is the logic in this? What is the gain for the person? There is no gain to be made. So that makes no sense. Also, and something that must be said, the type of test that was actually created back then is not the test of today. We have refined our understanding of exogenous hormones. The trials exist for a reason. In the 40s, when apparently Steve was on all of that secret sauce, most of the stuff was bunk. If you look at the researchers, in the 40s, most strain of test only increased aggressivity. It was barely anabolic. There was almost no androgenic effects. Why? They had to refine the product. There are actually stories, and maybe they're just myths, of Hitler and Stalin giving that type of test-based product to their soldiers to increase aggressivity. The goal was not to make super soldiers with 20 inches arms. So again, if even the top powers of the time who were at fucking war and who would have killed for that type of technology to be able to again create super soldiers were not able to put their hands on it, why would Steve Reeves have that? You thought he was on a Facebook group with Hitler and Stalin, he was chatting up with his pals? This makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. And all of these claims about Reeves being on steroids as if he was taking the top grade stuff is almost comical when you consider the fact that people like Bill Pearl and Ron Lacey, who were older than Reeves and competed after him, claimed that they had to resort to taking veterinarian products to be able to replicate the effects of test. These were not people that went to a TRT clinic and got their nice little prescription injected in their butt cheek by a nurse. They had to do it themselves. They had to do it through the black market because they had no such connections as the product builders have today. And they had to take shady fucking stuff. Like, imagine this. Peel was apparently taking things that had effects that were synonymous with anabolism, but had not really been tested for humans. And that was, again, in the 50s, 10 years after the clinical trial tests on humans, which shows one thing. These tests were maybe not conclusive, or they did not lead to the ability of bodybuilders to put their hand on the pure and pristine product, which meant that they had to just direct their attention towards subpar replicas of testosterone that were given to animals. 10 years after Steve Reeves. What was Reeves doing? Was he drinking horse urine directly? Like, was he sneaking in the garbage cans, like behind the clinics, trying to recuperate the vials and inject that, hoping that it was going to make him big? That also shows that these people never actually studied who Reeves was. Because if you know the guy and you know his life, that's typically the type of things that would make you raise an eyebrow. It is so out of character. I'm not saying the guy is a perfect angel, but the idea that in his 20s and 30s he would have resorted to these means when it is said that in his teenagehood he was already Superman, he was already so jacked that when he walked on the beach, people stopped and looked at him, make no sense. Or, if you want to push the craziness even further, you can say that he was on drugs when he was a teenager, at a time where it would have been actually factually impossible because test was not invented. But since the article is based on fallacies, we can even go further. Maybe Steve Reeves is a genius. Maybe he was able, in his bedroom, to just create testosterone 20 years before it was invented by scientists. Maybe that's possible. He bought one of these chemistry kits and he was just tinkering away, and just like that, he created trend. Let's settle on that. I think that is a great explanation. That is for the testosterone thing. It makes no sense. Just because in the early 40s there was a possibility of getting your hands on these products doesn't mean that it's possible. It's the same with IGF-1, for example, in the US. The hormone is discovered, but good luck getting your hands on IGF-1. It's the same. It is stupid to think that scientists of the time came up with tests to be able to give it to bodybuilders. Most of the molecules that bodybuilders use nowadays were recuperated after 10 years, 20 years of mainstream use. Like look at Anavar, look at Deca. These are things that we give to humans to heal them from problems that they might have. We started giving Anavar to people in the 40s as well. Are you going to tell me that bodybuilders were popping Anavar in the 40s? All of that, again, is very vague. From what we know, the earliest, 100% guaranteed time where we know there was massive drug use is in the 70s. It's during the golden era. In the 60s, we have our doubts, but in the 50s, most of the physiques you see in the 50s are natural. They look perfectly achievable. And so if there is foul play, it's either so minimal that it means almost nothing, or there is no foul play at all. But you will see that the guy who wrote the article knows that, because he tried to, in a sense, muddy the waters. He tried to actually present certain arguments that appear, again, reasonable at first glance, but then when you observe them for a second, they make no sense. He based his idea and his argument that Steve Reeves wasn't natural on the fact that Sergio Oliva said that he wasn't. So, in an interview conducted by Brian D. Johnston, Sergio Oliva stated the following, blah, 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 blah. Arnold was one of the first to bring steroids over to America, and everybody in the old days used them. Zane, Colombo, myself, Arnold, Harold, Dave, and even Steve Reeves. There's no way to deny it. And then he concludes immediately the article by saying, Steve Reeves has most likely experimented with some sort of early testosterone-based anabolic steroids. So he takes a quotation by someone who is not a reliable source, and then based on that, he makes an absolute conclusion. The issue is that the quotation itself is an abomination because it makes no sense logically. The guy himself, Sergio Oliva, states, Arnold was one of the first to bring steroids over to America. When did Arnold become big in America? In the 70s, 80s. But that was not during the time of Steve Reeves. Steve Reeves was not competing at that moment in time. The guy himself says it. So if the first and the earliest apparitions of steroids in America on the bodybuilding scene was during that time, well then, it debunks itself. Why include Steve Reeves in that list of names? Colombo, Zane, all of these guys, they're guys from the 60s, 70s. They're guys who were born in the 40s. Reeves was born in the 20s. He was part of the silver era. He was not a golden era bodybuilder. And if you compare his physique to that of the guys of that time, it's night and day. You can clearly see that it's not the same mass, not the same definition. One clearly looks like a human and the others look enhanced. They look superhuman. So by including that quote in his article to prove his point, he actually debunked his point. But I just want to point out the fact that apparently Arnold was the one to bring steroids over. Even that is a little bit questionable and dubious, isn't it? Because I made my little silly joke about the German on the phone with Reeves, But right now, it's exactly what's happening in this scenario. Like, Arnold took the plane one day with like buckets and buckets of Anavar stuffed up his ass, and he just flew to America, and then he gave that shit to everyone. That's him. Like, we can pin all of the steroid use in America on Arnold. Isn't that strange? I mean, we all know how much Arnold loved his Debo, but why is he the one who apparently was the catalyst to all of that stuff? And again, the best proof that Sergio Oliva was full of shit is the fact that he included Steve Reeves in the list as if he ever competed with him or knew him on a personal level. But keep in mind one thing. In the 50s, Sergio Oliva was a kid. Steve Reeves competed mainly in the 40s and 50s. Oliva was 9 years old during Steve Reeves' last competition. What the fuck does he know? You know what this makes me think of? I think that this is a typical case of téléphone arabe. Téléphone arabe is when you say something to a guy, he repeats it to a guy that repeats it to a guy. And after 10 people, the last person is going to have a completely different version of the facts than the first person. Why? It gets modified. So either Sergio Oliva made it up, because he was known to make shit up, he wasn't a reliable narrator, or he heard it from a guy that heard it from a guy. And we all know how humans are and how jealousy functions. What are the chances that Reeves' competition saw him and thought, oh, he must be cheating, he must be using something that we don't have. Then 10 years later, again, anachronically, retroactively, they heard about testosterone and they were like, oh, he must have been on that, even though it makes no sense. He had no physical ability to put his hands on these products. But this is how the legend started, and this is why every time you talk about Steve Reeves, you have a ton of people who say, oh, you know that Steve Reeves wasn't natural, right? And what do they base that on? Facts, logic. The type of logic that I just proved was completely stupid. Why? They don't think for themselves. It's the same thing as with the guy that wrote this article. What they want is, they desperately want a reason to explain why Steve Reeves looked like a beast and why they look like a melted candle. And so they will actually latch onto any excuse they can find, even if the excuse is demonstrably a lie. Why base an argument off of that type of testimony? Again, look at that list of names. Zane Colombo, Arnold, Dave Draper, Steve Reeves. You don't see a problem here. It's like le jeu des cinq différences, right? When you look at two pictures and it's like one is not like the other. What the fuck is Steve Reeves doing in that list? Because what I understand from this quote is that best case scenario or worst case scenario, Steve Reeves started to experiment with steroids at a later age, like in his 40s, for example, which I could buy. I mean, when he played Hercules, it's true that his physique was really, really advanced. But in his 20s and 30s, every single time you see a picture of Steve Reeves and people say, oh, that's my goal physique, it's a picture of him when he's young. It's not a picture of him during his movie career. It's when he was ripped on the beach. And that is the physique that people aspire to actually achieve. And it's also the type of physique that this guy includes in his articles, saying, oh, that's not natural because, again, drugs were available back then, and that guy said that Reeves was popping pills. This is typically the type of anachronical argumentation that this dude engages in all the time, hoping that you're too dumb to actually understand what is going on. But if you just look at the math and you compare the years, it stops making sense. So I hope that I managed to get those doubts out of your head. I personally firmly believe and would put money on the fact that Reeves was natural. For the first 10, 20 years of his prime, his prevalence in the bodybuilding scene, I don't really see any signs of him taking drugs. But it's important to say because the more you lift, the more you progress, and the more you interact on YouTube Fitness, the more you're going to encounter that type of person. The more you're going to encounter the type of person who tried as well, failed miserably, but instead of just giving up and leaving, they come back with a vengeance. This is a Steve Reeves fanboy. He has multiple articles about Steve Reeves, just reminiscing and just salivating about his physique. And yet at the same time, he seems to have, again, a personal vendetta against him. Why? Reeves is dead. The guy never knew Reeves. I think that what pisses him off the most is that Reeves got a physique that he could never achieve, and therefore, to feel better about himself, he points out the finger and says, well, Reeves was on drug, and therefore me not being able to achieve that physique is perfectly acceptable. Plot twist, it's not. Because for anyone who is 6'1", yes, it is in the cards for you to look not like Steve Reeves, but close to Steve Reeves. Again, Reeves was 215. But when you point that out to this guy, what does he say? This is the kicker, this is the one that takes the cake. Steve Reeves was big, 6'1", 215, but was not very lean. What's up with that? His answer is, Steve Reeves' body fat looks higher than it actually is because he's holding water, most likely due to testosterone use, which blurs definition. This is the type of guy that never trains, never researches programming, doesn't stick to a diet, but has spent hundreds of hours on bodybuilding forums researching hormones. This is the same guy that makes articles about who is natty or not. There is a clear and definitive bias because he is typically the type of man that now sees steroids everywhere. You know, it's the old saying of everyone who is smaller than me is a bitch, everyone who is bigger than me is on steroids. But the issue is that for this guy, no one is smaller than him. I mean, most fourth grader could beat him up. So, in his word and his view of the world, everyone is on drugs. And if you want proof of that, remember the last video I made about the guy, about the natural limit? Someone rightfully pointed out the fact that even if his math is correct, and even if, again, for some reason, Reeves was hooking up with German scientists and getting bottles of pills sent via fucking delivery pigeons, even if that's true, what about the bodybuilders of the Bronze Age? What about the guys who lived in the 1900s, in 1910, 1920, 1930, when testosterone was never even in creation? What did this guy say? Oh, for them, it doesn't count. Like, that was quite literally his argument. It doesn't count because apparently their stats were fake or the pictures were photoshopped. I'm not kidding you. This guy said that pictures of Eugene Sandow, for example, were shopped in 1920. Do you want to trust that guy? Or do you want to trust common sense? Because this is ridiculous. Just recently, I was actually looking at pictures of old school Indian bodybuilders from the same time period, just before test was invented in the 1910s, 1920s, and the guys blew me away with their physiques. They had amazing physiques. They had better physiques than most natural bodybuilders of today, and it's the same with Steve Reeves. And yet they lived 100 years ago. How is it possible that people who were 100% not on drugs and who had none of the information and resource we have beat us to that point? Well, it's because they were not poisoned by the type of just propaganda that is present on the internet, on these black pill forums. And keep in mind one thing again. If I took one of these pictures of the Indian bodybuilders, or even of an old school strongman, I colored them and showed them to Truth Seeker, his first words would say, oh yeah, that's not natural. And then if I revealed that these were taken 100 years ago, he would tell me, oh, there's foul play. Like, I guarantee you this is the type of person that would argue that Indians have invented testosterone before anyone else. Like, they discovered the molecule before anyone else and they kept it secret. As if scientists, again, would put in the work to come up with a molecule to use simply for bodybuilding's sake. That never happens. All of these EMG data things you see, all of the studies that are corroborated to fitness, that were not intended to serve fitness, for the most part are stupid because no one sat down in their chair thinking, I'm going to take 10 scientists and spend millions of dollars just to be able to make that guy bigger. That doesn't exist, and that also connects with my earliest point. Testosterone was never created for pro bodybuilding's sake. It was not created with in mind the idea to make people bigger. It's just a byproduct. And it's because bodybuilders realized the byproduct, in the 60s in particular, that it polluted the sport. But anyone before that in the 50s and 40s, like Reeves, you can trust. You can actually put your faith in the idea that this was a physique built by a man who has, in the sense, these same resources that you have, and who did not play tricks or did not actually use any type of outside help. So that is pretty much my point when it comes to this video in particular. Was Steve Reeves really a natural bodybuilder? The answer is yes. The better question would be, is the person who writes the Natty or Not articles actually in possession of a brain? And I think the answer to that is no. So I'm going to leave you with that. Thank you for watching. Have a good night.